There's been an awful lot of self reflection on the part of Democrats since Donald Trump was elected for a second time last month. One person who's been doing a lot of thinking about the direction of the party is Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator Murphy, good to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Let me ask you about the latest news. Christopher Wray just announced he'll be stepping down as the FBI director before his 10-year term is over. After Donald Trump said he intended to nominate Kash Patel to take his place. What do you think that means for the future of the FBI? And what is your reaction to Wray's resignation?
I'm not surprised. Obviously, I don't know exactly why Director Wray decided to step down early, but I have an idea why that is. I don't think he wants to serve one single day under Donald Trump. He sees the train wreck that is coming, and what's coming is a wholesale change in what the FBI represents. It's going to be not an independent law enforcement agency. It's going to be an arm of the White House, a political arm of the White House. Kash Patel, wrote a whole book on this, that he wants to rid the FBI of anybody who doesn't share the political ideology of the right wing. He's interested in targeting the political opponents of President Trump. Anybody that didn't try to rig the election in 2020 for Donald Trump is going to be a target. And I suspect Chris Wray doesn't want to spend a single day working under somebody that views the FBI, not as an independent law enforcement agency, but as a sort of political arm appendage of the White House.
Having said that, do you think Kash Patel will be confirmed?
I certainly don't hear any major significant resistance to Kash Patel's nomination. It's pretty remarkable that Republicans seem to be lining up for all sorts of nominees that aren't, at all qualified at best, and at worst are, openly advertising that they're going to transition this country away from democracy and democratic norms. So, I've had a couple of, Republicans that I regularly work with on bipartisan legislation that, in the past have exercised some independence from the mainstream of the party, all suggest that they're going to enthusiastically support Kash Patel. I think they'll come to regret that. But Donald Trump doesn't seem to be meeting much resistance in the Senate Republican caucus right now.
What about some of these other appointees or people who have been tapped, like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Pete Hegseth? Do you think that they will also get through the confirmation process relatively easily?
Yeah, it's a little too early to tell right now. Man, I would hope somebody like Pete Hegseth would have at least 3 or 4 Republicans who would come to the conclusion that somebody with that history of alcoholism, abuse of women, backwards views on Muslims in this country should be nowhere near the Department of Defense. It's not like he's the only person in the whole country that's qualified to run that department. You could find somebody else who doesn't have the litany of character flaws that Hegseth has. But I think you're seeing a party that we've known existed for a long time, but you're seeing it play out. They exist under Donald Trump's thumb. They are just not willing to stand up to him because he has telegraphed, if you try to cross me, I will try to eliminate you as a political figure inside the Republican Party. There are plenty of, marked gravestones of former Republican elected officials who lost their races because they got on the wrong side of Donald Trump. And Republican senators worked really hard to get their jobs. They don't want to lose their jobs, and they're going to do whatever is possible, even if that means confirming really dangerous, really unqualified nominees to run these departments. That's certainly my worry. That's my read of what's happening right now.
Senator Murphy, what's the latest intel on whether or not some of these candidates will undergo actual FBI background checks? I know there was talk about using independent or an agency outside of the FBI, some kind of investigative firm, and not the FBI. Does that trouble you?
Well, of course it does. The FBI, they're in the business of providing thorough background checks. They have information that independent agencies do not. We should absolutely demand FBI background checks. Now, the FBI background checks don't solve the problem. There's a limit to what the FBI can get their hands on. We have to make an independent decision as to whether these people are qualified to run these massive integrated departments. But my hope is that we'll get FBI background checks, but the FBI will have something to say about that after January 20th, right? There's a real potential that a Trump FBI will refuse to run and provide the background checks. We have to worry that every norm that we're used to may be destroyed after January 20th.
I think a lot of people listening to this will say, aren't there any guardrails? What can be done to ensure this whole process isn't just steamrolling Congress? What would you say to them?
That elections have consequences. I mean, Donald Trump told the American public, I'm going to convert our democracy into a dictatorship on day one. Like he said that, right? He said, I'm going to be a dictator on day one, meaning I'm not going to observe the Constitution. He told the American public in the campaign, I think the biggest threat to the United States are Democrats, right? Are my political opposition. I don't think the biggest threat is a terrorist group. I don't think it's Russia. I don't think it's a criminal gang. I think it's Democrats. That's what he said. And I'm going to use the military and law enforcement to target the enemy within, Democrats. So, he said that, and this country voted him in. We got to ask ourselves, why is that, right? Because I don't actually think that's what America wants. So there's something else that drew this country to Donald Trump. But I don't, we will do everything we can to use the court system, to use public pressure, to use a handful of Republicans in Congress who may be willing to stand up to Donald Trump to mount an opposition to Democratic backsliding. But it's not like he made any of this a secret when he ran.
Of all these people, who are you most concerned about?
Pam Bondi and Kash Patel. So what I am really concerned is that we lose the rule of law. That's what happens in democracies that stop being democracies. All of a sudden, you can't rely on a fair trial. You can't rely on a fair prosecution. All of a sudden, you get favors and immunity if you are a political supporter of the person in power, and you are specifically targeted, often very unfairly, if you are political opposition. You still have elections, right? But they don't matter as much because the opposition just disappears. Because most people, when faced with the threat of persecution or prosecution, decide to just lower their voice, recede into the background. So I am most worried about Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, who are being picked because they are willing to turn the Department of Justice into a witch hunt operation for Trump's political opposition. And you already see what's happening in the business world right now. So the mega billionaires in this country who run the information system have already telegraphed that they are not willing to fight. Comcast has announced they're selling MSNBC. They're getting out of the business of criticizing Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos did not make an endorsement in this last election, signaling that he does not want a fight either. Twitter is being run out of the White House right now. So you see signaling from very powerful people in this country that they do not want to criticize Donald Trump because they want to protect their billions. And you see a Department of Justice is about to be taken over by a crowd that may actually start locking up or threatening to lock up people in this country who try to oppose Donald Trump. That's the end of democracy. And I am definitely more alarmist than most of my colleagues are about this. I don't quite understand why there's a complacency in the political class that this isn't actually a real potential. And so I'm acting like we're on the precipice of potentially losing our democracy.
In fact, in a recent interview, President-elect Trump talked about members of the January 6th Commission and that they should be in jail. Do you really think they will make good, or Trump administration and the law enforcement agencies will actually make good on that? Or do you think that's more a rhetorical threat?
Listen, I think we got used to a Trump administration last time in which he said a lot of things that never came true. And that was because there were multiple levers of breaks in between what he said and what actually happened. Bill Barr, in his biography, his memoir, he was the attorney general at the end of Trump's time, explains how he sort of stepped in and stopped Trump from doing some of the most terrible things that he was proposing to do, in particular, hunt his political enemies. His chiefs of staff did that. I think probably Ivanka Trump did that every now and again. All those people are gone, and they have been replaced by sycophants, sometimes even further to the right on an assault on democracy than Donald Trump himself. So I don't think you can assume that what happened in his first term will happen in his second term. I think he's actually putting people in place, and Kash Patel is a perfect example. He's putting people in charge of these agencies who actually are less friendly to democracy than Donald Trump is.
I want to just put a button on this before I turn to the Democrats, Senator, and that's to ask you about Pam Bondi specifically. I think a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief when she was named because Matt Gaetz seemed to have so much baggage, to say the least. What is it about Pam Bondi? Because I don't think she has had the level of scrutiny some of these other people have had that is most concerning to you.
Yeah, I mean, why was Merrick Garland picked to be Attorney General? Why was Eric Holder picked to be Attorney General? Because they were qualified, because they believed in the rule of law applied equally to everybody. Yes, they shared some political sympathies with the president, but primarily because they were qualified law enforcement agents. Pam Bondi and Matt Gaetz were both picked for the exact same reason, because they have pledged absolute total loyalty to Donald Trump and have demonstrated over and over again that they are prepared to do whatever it takes to help Donald Trump's political career. Pam Bondi actively scuttled criminal investigations of Donald Trump's enterprise, Trump University in Florida, as a means of showing him that she was all in, that she was willing to look the other way when it came to the law in order to help Donald Trump's political career. So she may not be as publicly outrageous as Matt Gaetz. She may not have the massive public checkered history that Matt Gaetz has, but her qualification is the same. I don't care about the law if Donald Trump tells me to do something. And that's how we lose our democracy, that people put loyalty to cult and loyalty to their leader ahead of loyalty to the Constitution and loyalty to the law.
Let's talk about the Democratic Party. It's been over a month since the election, and the inauguration is not too far away. How have you seen the Democratic Party, other than looking at itself and wondering where it went wrong, change in the weeks since early November?
Well, I'm deeply worried because I haven't seen the kind of introspection that I would have hoped. I think that there's a lot of folks who look at the race and say, well, Trump, really didn't even get 50%. It wasn't a landslide. We almost won the House of Representatives. We just need some minor adjustments. I don't look at it that way. I think we need to recognize how unbelievable it is that we keep losing to somebody as reckless as Donald Trump, a felon, somebody who openly supported an insurrection against the United States government. We should not be satisfied to lose to somebody like that by such a slim margin. I also think it is morally unsustainable for our party to stand up and say, we're the party of poor people, and poor people don't want to vote for us. Like, how do you sort of wake up every morning and say, well, we're the party of poor people, but poor people don't like us? We're not listening to the people we claim to represent. And even if you can sort of minimize the political jeopardy that we're in after this election, there's a moral jeopardy we're in as a movement that will just exacerbate and get worse if we don't look it square in the face. So I think the answer to your question, Kate, is I haven't seen a lot of things changing in the Democratic Party yet. I'm arguing for some major change. Maybe we just needed a month or so to lick our wounds, but we got to get moving.
Well, you wrote a memo to fellow Democrats a couple of weeks after the election, and you talked about winning back low-income voters. You believe the key to doing that is taking on corporate greed. But with all due respect, Senator Murphy, hasn't the Democratic Party been talking about corporate greed ad nauseum for decades?
I don't, not in the way that translates to ordinary average voters. I mean, frankly, I think the Democratic Party, along with the Republican Party, has presided over an economy for the last 40 years that has done really, really well for folks at the very top of the income threshold. I mean, people sort of look at the economy that Democrats constructed, and it looks like it did really well for very, very rich people. And they look at who our coalition is, increasingly upper income individuals, and it doesn't look like we're sincere when we talk about corporate power. We also talk about it generally. We don't necessarily talk about it specifically. Now, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, they will take on specific companies, specific CEOs. But people notice when 90% of Democrats, when they talk about corporate greed, don't actually name anybody. That doesn't sound real or sincere. So I don't think people really believe that we want to deconstruct concentrated power. And I think that you saw you saw the hesitancy of the Democratic Party to make that a tentpole in the end of this last election. You
Why
know,
do you think?
why? Well, I think I think it's for a lot of reasons. I think we're generally uncomfortable with kind of black and white messaging. You know, we look at these CEOs and we're like, well, yeah, they've done some bad things to people, but they've also done some good things as well. I don't want to, make a story too simple. That's much more complex. I think we do end up spending a lot of time hanging around the donor class, millionaires and billionaires who fund our campaigns. I think that compromises us. And we get addicted to other messaging. So in the end of this last campaign, we decided that democracy was, going to be the tentpole. And so that meant that Kamala Harris spent the campaign, campaigning side by side with Liz Cheney, who is not somebody who roots at all for corporate power to be interrupted. And it made it look like this wasn't a priority for the Democratic Party, that we sort of allowed into our tent people who were hostile to the deconstruction of concentrated economic power. I just think we have to admit that.
It seems to me that rather than putting corporate greed into the crosshairs, one of the reasons people gravitated toward Donald Trump is because, rightly or wrongly, they felt, in Bill Clinton's words, that he felt their pain, right? And focusing on corporate greed seems to me a questionable tactic, because people feel like they want to know, how is government going to make their lives better, not how they're being screwed by corporations. But what have you done for me lately as Joe citizen?
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, but people do want to know who's screwing them, right? They know that power is, not exactly a zero-sum game, but is not infinite. And if you are going to help me, you are going to have to actually take power from somebody else. So you are not wrong that people want sort of tangible policies that's going to help them, but there's nothing wrong with explaining why and how people have exploited you and how we are going to end that exploitation. Let's take the housing market, for instance. These financial companies that have been buying up apartment buildings all over the country, jacking up rates, imposing burdensome fees, are killing Americans. And they are making gross, disgusting amounts of profit off of exacerbating a rent crisis in this country. We should tell that story. We should talk about the people that have done this in the name of becoming billionaires. And then we should deliver solutions, right? A cap on rent increases, a prohibition on financial companies owning more than X amount of apartment stock in a particular community. Yeah, talk about solutions, but don't be afraid to tell the story to people of how they're getting screwed. What Donald Trump's movement is in part about grievance, right? Donald Trump wins elections, I don't, yes, in part because he sort of feels people's pain, but because he spends most of his time telling you who's doing it to you. Now, he's wrong when he explains that it's Mexican immigrants or Muslims or college presidents, but he spends an awful lot of time telling the story about who is hurting Americans. And, Americans tend to like that story.
What are other ways Democrats can feel or seem more connected to what used to be the traditional Democratic base, blue collar voters that without college educations?
Stop being so judgmental about, low income voters who don't line up with us on the sort of host of social, cultural, and hot button issues that we believe in as a party. I'm obviously support an assault weapons ban. I believe climate change is an existential crisis. I'm pro gay rights. I'm pro choice. Um, but I don't know that the party should exclude from our ranks people who don't line up with us on those four issues and four others. When we were a really big, powerful party, when we had huge majorities in the Senate and the House, it was in part because we let people into our tent that disagreed with us on those issues. We broadly wanted you to agree with us on populist economics, but we had disagreements on the environment, on guns, on choice. And I think it would be healthier for our party and for our country if the Democrats became a little bit more of a diverse party on non-economic issues for a whole bunch of reasons, not just because that's how you win elections, but also because, in a world where everybody exists in their little closed information ecosystem, we can't convince anybody that's not inside our tent because they're just getting all their news from sources that agree with them. So at least if you let them in and they don't believe in an assault weapons ban, I have a chance once they're in the room to try to change their position. So I think that that's a big part of it as well, signaling that we're not as exclusionary as we've become.
What are other big cultural issues where you think Democrats should be less, I don't know, for lack of a better term, self-righteous and more open-minded?
Well, I mean, I think I named the big ones. Obviously, in this last election, let's like not sugarcoat it. This issue of girls in sports and medical
And transgender bathrooms. And
transgender
really,
bathrooms, right?
I think the transgender issue, if you think about the Kamala Harris cares about they, them, Donald Trump cares about you, was one of the most successful or effective campaign ads and certainly ran a lot during the final days of the campaign. But does that mean that Democrats should stop standing up for trans people?
No, it does not, right? So you can stand up for trans people. You can stand up for the right of girls to participate in sport. Well, understanding that this is a relatively new development in this country, and that people need some time to sort of make the journey that maybe some of us have made more quickly. So I think often we telegraph a judgmentalism about people who disagree with us in a way that pushes people off. But
A
here's the
preachiness, perhaps,
yeah,
or
but
a lecturing.
yeah. I had a candidate in my office just yesterday who ran in a deeply red state for Senate. And he said, people in my state think the Democrats stand for two things: spending their money on people, who don't deserve it, and turning boys into girls, with forced surgeries, right? And I was like, listen, I show up to work every single day in the United States Senate. We are not working on promoting gender changing surgeries, right? Like that is not a top 50 issue for the Democratic Party, but for Republican voters in this country, they think it's one of our top two issues. And that speaks to a bigger, more structural problem, which is the way that information is delivered. One of the things that Democrats are going to have to work on is building our own means of delivering information, not just renting space when election time comes, not sort of standing down and allowing this massive conservative media infrastructure to exist in a vacuum, but putting together competing programming that
A
isn't.
lot of people might say, Chris Murphy, hey, that's MSNBC, that's CNN to a large degree.
Yeah, but that's pretty hard news, right? Whereas what the conservatives have done is build kind of hybrid entertainment information networks where you sort of get everything that you want all in one place. And we've largely built it on TV, whereas they've built it online. If you look at who the top 10 Facebook posts come from every single day, it largely comes from conservatives. That's not because there's more conservatives on Facebook than progressives. It's just they have a lot more places to go to on social media than we do because they spend a lot of money on that. They spend a lot of money on building up options, conservative information options for people to find online. Democrats do not do that. We're going to have to do that.
But don't you think that will only exacerbate polarization and divide the country even further? What about showing up more on places like Fox News or conservative radio
Yeah,
stations or programs?
yeah, both and right. So I think you're exactly right. Um, we've got to understand that going on MSNBC is not fixing the problem. There's, some information out there suggesting that maybe like 10% of swing voters watch any cable news. So there's no way you're talking to people that matter unless you are being a lot less selective about the platforms that you're engaging in. So we have to be all over the place. We have to be on a lot of different platforms. But again, remember this. We sometimes bemoan the world we are living in today, where there's a whole bunch of conservative media and there's a whole bunch of liberal media. But that was the 1800s, right? Every city had two newspapers. One was the newspaper for the right, one was the newspaper for the left. At the founding of the country, you had organs, media organs that followed one side versus the other. We've always had a history of partisan media sources. I don't think we should be as afraid about that. The problem is we're just like not engaging in that fight right now. Democrats are not building that infrastructure. Republicans are.
You mentioned the media landscape. Reportedly, John Fetterman became the first Democrat to join Truth Social. What's your reaction to that? Is that a place that you think you should be?
Maybe. I mean, I haven't sort of analyzed every single place that Democrats should be, but yeah, I think we've got to be a lot less selective. We've got to be intentional in the conversation that we're trying to have with people who disagree with us. I mean, Donald Trump's a fraud. He talks a game of populism, and he's putting in charge of his cabinet billionaires who are just going to rig the rules of government for themselves. His entire economic agenda is likely to be a big tax cut for his friends. But his followers don't know that because they exist in a world where we don't ever communicate with them. So, yeah, I think we probably have to be talking to Republicans anywhere they exist, conservatives, anywhere they exist, instead of just continuing to talk to people who agree with us. And I say that
Clearly,
as he goes on MSNBC all the time. Like I'm to blame, right? I mean, because it's like a lot easier to talk to people that agree with you. It's harder to go and talk to somebody that's a little bit more hostile. And our lives are not easy. So we try to make our media encounters as, friendly as possible.
clearly, you don't believe that Donald Trump is going to help the average working person in this country, as you just outlined. But what real policies do you think do the Democrats have that they can offer some people who have lost so much faith in your party?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have to be really laser focused on delivering people economic power, delivering them the kind of connection to community that they feel like they have lost. There's a real spiritual crisis happening in this country. People feel like they have no power. They work hard, they get a paycheck, and they're not getting ahead. Their kids have no help, have no hope of living a better life than they did. And they feel really lonely, really disconnected. It feels like you're just supposed to wake up every day and buy stuff, participate in the economy instead of engaging in more sort of meaningful interaction with, human beings. So Democrats have to talk about ways to deliver people economic power. That's why we should be really loud about it. An increase in the minimum wage. That's why we should be actively trying to break up these big corporations that, almost act as private governments these days, totally unaccountable, setting the rules that we have to live by. That's why we should be talking about, things like a cap on credit card interest rates, a cap on rental increases on an annual basis. Just give people a little bit more breathing room, a little bit more control over their economic lives. And then don't be afraid to talk about loneliness. Take on the tech companies for delivering into our hands these toxins, these poisons that encourage our kids into lives of withdrawal. Let's really talk about building healthier downtowns again, places where people can meet. Let's support churches and unions, places on the right and the left that have gotten really weak over the last 20 years, where you used to find friends and learn selflessness. Instead of giving handouts to people, the child tax credit, and Obamacare subsidy, let's unrig the rules so that if you start a small business, you start a small bookstore, it won't get stomped out of existence on the second day by one of the big boxes. Let's just make it easier for your hard work to lead to success instead of trying to compensate for an unfair economy by handing you a check. Those are the things that Democrats can talk about: power, connection, and I think it'll be a really strong and important contrast with the Trump administration that is going to, be unrigging the rules, but unrigging the rules to provide even further help for the very, very wealthy.
Incumbents normally get shellacked during the midterms. Are you expecting that in the first 2 years of the incoming Trump administration, there will be significant damage done and the pendulum might swing again toward the Democrats?
I mean, if we have a democracy, right? We talked at the beginning about my main worry, the thing that I wake up, in the middle of the night thinking about, which is the Department of Justice being turned into an operation to suppress political dissent. So that when I call somebody to make a donation to my campaign or to my friend's campaign 2 years from now, they'll say, I saw what happened to my buddy who rounded up a bunch of donations for Democrats. He got a call the next day from the IRS, or the Department of Justice came knocking on his door to ask him some questions. That's how you lose your democracy. So yeah, I think if we still have a democracy 2 years from now, we'll probably do pretty well because I think the Republicans will overreach. They think they have a mandate. They don't really. But job one is making sure that that democracy still exists. And that requires the American public to sort of stand up and mount a resistance to somebody like Kash Patel being in charge of the FBI, and not just lying down and thinking that it'll be business as normal and just rhetorical attacks on democracy. It may be real attacks on democracy.
Let me ask you two questions, if I could, Senator, from my audience. One person's asked, do you feel the Democratic Party, is more centrist, or does it lead too far left? Of course, that has been a big conversation among party officials and the public writ large about if the Democratic Party has become too left-leaning. Do you think this message of Donald Trump's victory may pull the party closer to the center?
Well, again, I just think it's important for us to open up our party to people who believe in a lot of different things when it comes to kind of traditional right left issues, like something like guns or abortion. I don't know that sort of deconstructing economic power and taking on concentrated wealth and raising the minimum wage, I don't know that that's traditionally right left. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican and one of the biggest antitrust crusaders. There are plenty of people today on the right who argue that the economy can't work if workers can't earn a fair wage. So what I want is for the Democratic Party to just make economic populism, giving workers the priority, not investors, giving workers the priority, make that the tentpole, and then just allow for a little bit more diversity of view after that.
Someone else asks, why don't Democrats fight back more aggressively? You often hear that Democrats and Republicans play by different rules, that Republicans really are much shrewder in terms of their approach, and Democrats are too obsessed with kind of being nice and above board. And the famous line by Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high. Is it time for the Democrats to change their strategy on that? Or, what are your views?
Yeah, listen, I think it's a really great question. And it's one that I grapple with every single day, right? Right. Norms matter. It's how we hold together our country. So if Republicans are celebrating political violence as they are today, when Donald Trump says he's going to pardon the January 6th protesters. And he goes further than that. He says, the protesters that I'm really focused on are the ones who have served the long jail terms. Those are the ones that were engaged in the worst violence. The ones that have been in jail for a long time are the ones that actually beat the police officers over the head with the flagpoles. And he says he's going to let those people out of jail. I mean, so what do I do? Do I meet that with a embrace of political violence? No way. Like, no way. But let's take Biden's pardon, right? The Trump administration has made it totally clear that if they get power, they are going to hunt Biden's supporters and Biden's family. And so if you're Joe Biden and Trump is telling you he's not going to play by the rules and he's going to make it a mission to try to prosecute, persecute, intimidate your family members, shouldn't you protect them? He's not playing by the rules, so shouldn't you stretch the rules a little bit as well? I think they're really tough questions. I think we will have to play harder, but I think it's hard for a lot of us who came into this business for the right reason to just start playing dirty. I just don't know that I want this job if that's how I had to get along to, for instance, threaten people with violence in order to get what I want. I just can't do that.
And finally, one of my followers asked, how are Democrats developing a deeper bench of talent and organizing down ballot? Do you see a lot of people when you look around in the Democratic Party who you think could run for president in 2028?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a long list of governors and senators and congressmen. Listen, I think we will have a very robust competition in 2028. But I really think that it's important that we, nominate people who are, who are really diverse in their backgrounds. There's a group that I was talking to yesterday that's going to really focus on nominating people for office that aren't lawyers, right, or professors, or the host of other professions that tend to sort of be the feeder system for politics. Why aren't, as the Democratic Party, the party that says we're the party of working class, why aren't we nominating more people with working class backgrounds? Why aren't we?
Or like John Fetterman's?
Yeah, well, or Dan Osborne, the candidate in Nebraska who ran as an independent, not as a Democrat, but was a union
and
organizer.
lost.
But ran further ahead of Kamala Harris than any other Senate candidate in the country, which I think shows that nominating somebody from he worked in the Kellogg's factory in Nebraska. I think you've got to nominate. I still think you should nominate some lawyers, but we don't. It doesn't have to be. We don't have to have a monopoly on the nomination process. And people get that. People are like, wait a second, you say you're the party of poor people, but are you nominating poor people for office? Yeah, I think we just have to do a better job of nominating, folks who don't come from a very exclusive set of backgrounds.
In fact, you say there's a long list. Are you on that list, Chris Murphy?
I don't think so. I like this. I like this job. I've still got a couple of kids at home who probably don't want to live that life. What I'm focused on is just fixing this party and this party's brand. Nobody that runs for president in 2028 will win if the Democratic Party doesn't win back the lower income voters, the working class voters that we are consistently losing. So I'm just on a mission to try to improve our policy and our message so that anybody who runs in 2028 has a shot.
P.S. That did not sound like a clear no, Senator, but I'll let it go this time.
Thanks for letting me off the hook there, Katie. But yeah, I think I'm stuck where I am. I like this gig.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for talking to us. It's going to be a very interesting 4 years, and we'll see how many of your fears become reality, and what will happen when Donald Trump is firmly in charge.
Yeah, I just sort of feel like the worst thing that we could do is to not envision the worst case scenario and then wake up and be surprised and have had no conversation about fighting back. So I admit that my vision may be a little bit more alarmist than most about the risk to democracy, but I don't know. Better safe than sorry is my general approach to life.
All right. Senator Murphy, thanks again. Great to see you.
Thank you.